These are the 10 worst disasters in Mount Everest history. Tragedies that killed climbers, sparked global controversy, and changed mountaineering forever. More than 340 people have died on the world's highest peak since 1922, some caught in avalanches, some frozen to death in blizzards, and some simply abandoned by their guides and left to die. Today we're walking through each of these disasters in detail, from the first recorded deaths on Everest more than a century ago to the deadliest climbing season in history, which happened just 2 years ago. Along the way we'll meet the guides who made fatal decisions, the survivors who defied impossible odds, and the Sherpas whose sacrifices made everyone else's summit dreams possible. What you'll see is a pattern of human ambition colliding with a peak where the air is too thin to sustain life, and the weather can turn lethal in minutes. Understanding what makes Everest deadly matters before we get to the disasters themselves. And the answer starts with altitude. Everest summit sits at 29,032 feet in what climbers call the death zone, everything above 26,000 feet, where there's only about 1/3 the oxygen you'd breathe at sea level. Once you enter that zone, brain cells start dying, muscles deteriorate, blood thickens, and judgment fails at the exact moment you need it most. Roughly 70% of all deaths on Everest happen during descent. And that number tells you everything about how climbers burn through their reserves reaching the top and have nothing left for the trip down. Death rates dropped from about 5% in the early expeditions to roughly 1% today, but that 1% adds up across thousands of attempts. And as of 2024, the Himalayan database records over 340 deaths against about 12,900 summits. Between 200 and 300 bodies remain frozen on the slopes because recovery at that altitude is nearly impossible. And some of those corpses have become navigation landmarks that climbers use to confirm they're on the correct route. With that context established, we start with the disaster that shocked the world more than any other, even though it wasn't the deadliest by numbers. If you have heard of only one Everest disaster, the 1996 tragedy is likely it. Because 8 people died in a single storm that later spawned a best-selling book, an Oscar-winning documentary, and a major Hollywood film, making it the most documented mountaineering disaster in history. On May 10, 1996, 33 climbers from multiple expeditions pushed toward the summit despite ominous weather forecasts. Driven by a desperate desire to reach the top after weeks of preparation and tens of thousands of dollars spent. 2 commercial expeditions led the charge, adventure consultants run by New Zealand guide Rob Hall, and Mountain Madness led by American climbing legend Scott Fisher. Fixed ropes hadn't been pre-installed at key points like the balcony and the Hillary Step, and that failure caused hour-long delays as climbers bunched up waiting their turn to ascend. Most expeditions agreed on a strict 2 p.m. turnaround, operating on simple logic. Miss that deadline and you won't make it back to camp before dark. Climber after climber ignored that deadline on May 10th, with some not reaching the summit until 4 p.m., and they were still in the death zone when a blizzard struck that evening with winds exceeding 70 miles per hour and complete whiteout conditions that left climbers separated, disoriented, and running out of oxygen. Rob Hall, the 35-year-old New Zealander who had guided 39 clients to the summit of Everest, more than any other guide in history, refused to abandon his struggling client Doug Hansen near the south summit. Both men died because of that decision. Hansen's body vanished and rescuers never located it, but Hall's remains are still up there today at his wife's request, who said he should stay where he'd like to have stayed. Before he died, Hall managed one final satellite phone call patched through to his pregnant wife Jan Arnold back in New Zealand, and his last words to her were, "Sleep well, my sweetheart. Please don't worry too much." Scott Fisher, the 40-year-old larger-than-life American guide who had summited Everest without supplemental oxygen, succumbed to exhaustion and altitude sickness at a feature called The Balcony, roughly 1,000 feet below the summit. Doug Hansen, the 46-year-old postal worker Hall died trying to save, perished alongside his guide. Andy Harris, a 31-year-old New Zealand guide, disappeared and his body never turned up. Yasuko Namba, a 47-year-old Japanese climber, died from exposure on the South Col after rescuers left her for dead. 3 Indian climbers on the north side also perished that night. Tsewang Samanla, Dorje Morup, and Sewang Paljor, and Paljor's body became a grim landmark in the years that followed. Still wearing distinctive green mountaineering boots, his corpse lay in a small cave on the northeast ridge for decades, and climbers began calling him Green Boots because he marked a specific point on the route, a frozen reminder of what happens when conditions turn against you. Beck Weathers, a Dallas pathologist on Rob Hall's expedition, got caught in the open when the storm hit along with Yasuko Namba and several others. Rescuers found them the next morning badly frostbitten and hypothermic, and both Weathers and Namba were left for dead because their condition seemed so severe that attempting a rescue would only endanger others. Namba did die, but what happened to Weathers defied every expectation. After more than 22 hours in the storm and more than 15 hours in a hypothermic coma, he woke up and walked into camp under his own power. 2 different rescue teams had concluded he was beyond saving. Frostbite claimed his right arm below the elbow, all the fingers on his left hand, parts of both feet, and his nose, which doctors later reconstructed using tissue from his ear and forehead. The 1996 disaster also created one of the great controversies in climbing history, centered on Russian mountaineer Anatoly Bukrev, who guided for Scott Fischer's Mountain Madness expedition. Bukrev climbed without supplemental oxygen and descended ahead of his clients when the weather turned, and John Krakauer, who survived the storm and later wrote the best-selling book Into Thin Air, attacked Bukrev harshly for these decisions. The other side of that story looks different. While Krakauer sheltered in his tent, Bukrev went back out into the storm alone and pulled off multiple rescues, saving 3 lives that night. The American Alpine Club awarded him the David A. Sauls Memorial Award for heroism. Veteran climber Galen Rowell pointed out that Krakauer was asleep in his tent while Bukrev was rescuing other climbers, and that debate still generates arguments today. A 2004 University of Toronto study found that atmospheric oxygen dropped an additional 6% during the storm, translating to a 14% reduction in oxygen uptake for the climbers trapped in it, which turned a difficult situation into a deadly one, partly because the air itself became thinner than normal. Strict turnaround times became non-negotiable after 1996, satellite phones turned into standard equipment, and the disaster spawned endless debate about whether commercial guiding belongs on Everest at all. 15 people died on Everest in 1996, with 8 of them perishing on May 10th and 11th, but a deadlier single day came 19 years later. April 25th, 2015 holds the record for the most deaths on Everest in a single day. At 11:56 a.m. local time, a magnitude 7.8 earthquake struck Nepal with its epicenter about 220 kilometers from Everest, and the effects reached the mountain within seconds. A massive ice avalanche broke loose from the ridge between 2 neighboring peaks, Pumori and Lingtran, dropping more than 1,000 meters before slamming into Everest Base Camp, where 359 climbers had gathered. The air blast killed as many people as the ice itself, because an avalanche that size creates a hurricane-force shockwave that throws tents, equipment, and human beings through the air like debris. One witness described it as if an enormous bomb had detonated. Another 100 to 170 climbers remained stranded higher up at Camps 1 and 2, with their route through the Khumbu icefall destroyed by the earthquake, and the medical tent known as Everest ER lay demolished in the blast. Between 19 and 22 people died in that avalanche. Dan Fredenberg, the 33-year-old Google executive who served as head of privacy for Google X, suffered fatal head injuries. Dr. Marissa Eve Girawong, a 28-year-old physician's assistant from New Jersey working as the base camp doctor, also perished. Tom Taplin, a 61-year-old Denver filmmaker documenting life at base camp, died alongside at least 10 Nepalese Sherpas and climbers from China, Japan, Australia, and elsewhere. A helicopter pilot known only as Jason performed extraordinary feats during what became the largest high-altitude rescue in history, using a 100-foot long line to extract casualties from nearly 20,000 feet. Over 2 days, helicopters evacuated 60 climbers from Camp 1 and 170 from Camp 2. 2 severely injured climbers made it to Kathmandu, but died before surgeons could operate. American guide Dave Hahn described what he saw in the aftermath, There was no backslapping, no cheering, no high fives. It was as if an enormous bomb had detonated. We each walked slowly through the obliterated camps, stopping to understand how much force had bent this or that bit of steel. For the first time since 1974, a gap of 41 years, no one summited Everest from the Nepal side that season. Combined with the disaster from the previous year, 2 consecutive canceled seasons gutted Nepal's climbing economy. The avalanche at base camp represented just one small part of a much larger catastrophe, as that earthquake killed more than 8,000 people across Nepal and left entire villages in ruins. The year before, the earthquake brought a different kind of tragedy, one that killed only Sherpas, and one that changed the conversation about who actually takes the risks on Everest. The Khumbu Icefall is a frozen river of ice flowing down Everest's lower slopes on the Nepal side, constantly moving, constantly shifting, constantly fracturing. Massive blocks of ice called seracs, some as big as office buildings, collapse without warning. When one lets go, there is nowhere to run. Every climber on the standard Nepal route passes through the Khumbu Icefall multiple times. And here's the detail that explains why Sherpas die at such high rates. Paying clients typically cross it 6 to 8 times during an expedition, while Sherpas, the workers who carry equipment, fix ropes, and establish camps, cross it 30 to 40 times. On April 18, 2014, at approximately 6:45 a.m., a massive serac collapsed in a section of the icefall known as the Popcorn Field. Technical analysis estimated it at 34.5 meters thick, weighing 14,300 tons. 25 men were buried and 16 died. Every single victim was a Nepalese Sherpa. Ang Kaji Sherpa had completed half a dozen Everest expeditions and left behind 6 children. Tsering Anshu Sherpa, 33 years old, left a wife and children. Abiral Rai, just 23, died on his first Everest attempt. Aisha Gurung, 28, left behind 2 toddlers. 3 of the 16 bodies were never recovered and remain under 80 to 100 meters of ice. What happened next had never occurred in Everest history. The Sherpas organized and refused to work. The Nepal government's initial compensation offer came to 40,000 Nepali rupees per family, roughly $400 American, barely enough to cover funeral costs. On April 22nd, 4 days after the avalanche, Sherpas voted to suspend all climbing operations for the remainder of the 2014 season, the first strike in Everest history. Their demands included raising death compensation from $4,000 to $20,000, doubling medical and life insurance, building a memorial to the dead, and protecting workers who refused to enter dangerous routes. Veteran American mountaineer Conrad Anker described the Khumbu Icefall this way: "It's essentially a game of Russian roulette. There is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide." Nimadoma Sherpa, one of the widows, put it more simply: "The main pillar of your house is not there." Since Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay first climbed Everest in 1953, approximately 50 Sherpas have died in the Khumbu Icefall alone. Sherpas face roughly 10 times the mortality rate of commercial fishermen, which the CDC ranks as the most dangerous non-military occupation in America. The 2014 climbing season effectively ended after the strike, with 334 permits sold and almost none used. Jennifer Peetham's documentary, Sherpa, brought global attention to the exploitation of the workers who carry the loads, fix the ropes, and absorb the greatest risks so that wealthy foreigners can claim they climbed Everest. Nepal eventually increased insurance payouts and announced a new route through the center of the icefall, but Sherpas still do the most dangerous work, still cross the icefall dozens of times per season, and still die at disproportionate rates. As of 2024, Sherpas account for about 39% of all deaths on Everest, despite making up a fraction of the total climbers. The 2023 season killed more people than any other in Everest history, and what made it so lethal wasn't a single catastrophic event, but a combination of failures across the entire season. Nepal issued a record 478 climbing permits that year, while temperatures dropped to the coldest in decades. A respiratory virus swept through the camps. Reports emerged of oxygen being stolen from high camps, and budget operators continued accepting clients who lacked the experience to survive at altitude. On April 12th, 3 Sherpas fixing ropes in the Upper Khumbu icefall died when their section collapsed. Pemba Tenjing Sherpa, 31 years old, Lakpa Rita Sherpa, 24, and Dawa Chhiri Sherpa, 45. All 3 worked for a Nepali operator called Imagine Nepal, and their bodies were located but deemed too dangerous to recover. Deaths accumulated through May. Jonathan Sugarman of the United States, 69 years old, died at Camp 2 on May 1st. Victor Brinza of Moldova died at the South Col on May 17th. Zhui Binchen of China, 52 years old, died near the South Summit on May 18th. Jason Bernard Kennison of Australia, 40 years old, died near the balcony on May 21st. Dr. Peter Swart, a 63-year-old South African Canadian, died on May 24th after turning back at the South Col. Hungarian climber Szilard Suhajda vanished while attempting a solo climb without supplemental oxygen. Between 17 and 18 deaths were confirmed by season's end, with several more listed as missing. Guy Cotter of Adventure Consultants, one of the most respected operators in the business, described what his teams faced. It was a very cold season, the coldest my staff and I have ever experienced. First time in 30 years any of our Sherpas suffered frostbite. Austrian operator Lucas Furtenbosch offered a blunter assessment. Apart from the 3 Sherpas in the icefall, I am convinced all other deaths could have been avoided by following safety standards. The numbers back him up. According to one analysis, 23 of the 26 deaths in 2023 and 2024 combined occurred with budget operators, companies that charge less, cut corners, and accept clients without adequate experience. Calls for experience requirements and permit limits intensified after 2023, but nothing changed before the 2024 season began. The photograph from May 2019 probably crossed your screen, even if you don't remember the context, because on May 22nd, Nepali mountaineer Nirmal Purja posted an image to Instagram that spread everywhere within hours. It showed more than 320 climbers standing in a near-continuous line along the summit ridge, waiting their turn to reach the top of Mount Everest. They looked like commuters queued for a train, except they stood at 29,000 feet, where every minute depletes oxygen reserves and kills brain cells. Nepal issued a record 381 permits that year, and Cyclone Fani delayed the climbing season, compressing the available weather windows into just a few days. When a 3 to 4 day window finally opened in late May, hundreds of climbers surged upward at once. Traffic jams formed in the death zone, with climbers standing in line for hours, burning through oxygen supplies, waiting to clip onto fixed ropes and move a few feet forward. 11 people died during the 2019 season. Anjali Kulkarni of India, 55 years old, reached the summit on May 22nd, but died during descent while stuck in the queue. Donald Lynn Cash of the United States, also 55, collapsed the moment he reached the summit. Robin Haynes Fisher, a 44-year-old British climber, died from altitude sickness at about 28,200 feet. Christopher Coolish, a 62-year-old American, suffered a cardiac event near the South Col. Canadian filmmaker Aaliyah Saikali climbed that week and described what he witnessed. "I cannot believe what I saw up there. Death, carnage, chaos, lineups, dead bodies on the route." Veteran climber Jim Davidson put it this way: "We're up in the death zone at 26,000 feet, so even on bottled oxygen, you're slowly dying." Everest analyst Alan Arnett estimated that 5 of the 11 deaths that season resulted directly from the crowds, not from weather, not from avalanches, but from waiting in line. Nepal's tourism officials pushed back, with the director calling the traffic jam claims baseless, and some guides blamed decision-making issues rather than overcrowding. That season produced 877 summits, a pre-pandemic record, and the permits alone generated $4.2 million in revenue for Nepal, which explains why the government resists calls for permit caps. The first disaster on Everest happened in 1922 during only the second expedition to attempt the peak. Charles Bruce led the expedition, and among its members was George Mallory, who would become the most famous name in Everest history. On June 7th, during their third summit attempt of the season, Mallory led 14 porters through the icy slopes toward the North Col, along with Howard Somervell and Colin Crawford. Mallory made a critical error by directing the party straight up instead of traversing the slopes and curves to reduce avalanche risk. About 30 meters of heavy snow broke loose. The European climbers in the lead were partially buried but managed to free themselves. Behind them, 9 porters and 2 rope teams were swept into a crevasse. Rescuers pulled out 2 alive, confirmed 6 dead, and could not retrieve 1 body, bringing the final toll to 7. A memorial cairn built at base camp in 1924 lists their names: Lhakpa, Narbu, Pasang, Pema, Sangye, Temba, and Antarg. These 7 Sherpas were the first to die on Mount Everest itself, because although a British climber named A.M. Kellis had died of exhaustion on the approach in 1921, no one had died on the actual mountain before June 7, 1922. Mallory wrote to his wife Ruth, "The consequences of my mistake are so terrible," and he vowed never again to let porters climb without a European attached to the same rope. The 1922 expedition was also the first to use supplemental oxygen and set a world altitude record of 8,321 meters, about 27,300 feet. At the 1924 Winter Olympics in Chamonix, expedition members received Olympic gold medals for alpinism, and gold medals were also awarded posthumously to the 7 Sherpas who died, marking the first official recognition of the debt that Everest climbing owes to Nepali workers. The 1970 disaster connects to one of the most audacious stunts in mountaineering history. Yuichiro Miura, a Japanese speed skiing champion, wanted to ski down Mount Everest, not from the summit because that was impossible, but from as high as he could reach. Making it happen required 800 porters, 27 tons of equipment, a 185-mile trek to reach the mountain, and a film crew to document everything. On April 5, 1970, the expedition was establishing its route through the Khumbu Icefall at about 5,700 meters when seracs collapsed and triggered an avalanche that killed 6 Sherpas: Mima, Norbu, Nima, Dorje, Chering, Tarki, Pasang, Kunga Norbu, and Kami Chering. 4 days later, on April 9th, falling ice killed another porter named Kiak Tsering in a lower section of the icefall. 7 dead in less than a week, all of them Nepali workers. Miura later explained why he continued. "For a moment I thought of stopping the expedition, but later I felt in order to meet their sacrifice, I must not run away. To pay back the respect to them, I felt it was my responsibility to face the challenge and complete it." On May 6, 1970, Miura became the first person to ski down Mount Everest, descending 6,600 feet in 2 minutes and 20 seconds, starting from about 8,000 meters. Using a parachute for braking, he reached speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour, fell 400 meters at one point, and stopped just 76 meters from a deadly crevasse. The documentary, The Man Who Skied Down Everest, won the 1975 Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. Miura later summited Everest at age 70 in 2003, at the time making him the oldest person to reach the top. The 7 Sherpas who died making his ski descent possible rarely get mentioned, and their deaths established a pattern that repeated for decades. The Khumbu Icefall kills Sherpas at vastly higher rates than the climbers they serve. The 1974 French expedition attempted something no one had done: the complete ascent of Everest's West Ridge direct, one of the most demanding unclimbed routes on the mountain. Expedition leader Gérard de Vuassus, a 34-year-old Chamonix mountain guide, deputy mayor of Chamonix, and high mountain rescue expert, ranked among the most respected alpinists in France. His team arrived in late August, hoping the monsoon season had ended, and established camps through the first week of September, but the monsoons returned unexpectedly. Between 7:10 and 7:30 p.m. on September 9th, a massive avalanche originating at around 7,000 meters swept through camps 1 and 2. Both camps were destroyed. 6 climbers were buried: De Vuassus and 5 Sherpas named Pemba Dorje, Lakpa, Nawang Lutuk, Nima Wangchu, and Sanu Wongol. Rescuers never found any remains. French mountaineering legend Maurice Herzog, himself a former mayor of Chamonix, reflected on De Vuassus' death. "In the last municipal elections, he had more votes than me." The 1974 disaster brought the total Everest death toll to 36, and demonstrated the extreme avalanche risk of attempting the West Ridge Direct during post-monsoon season. 2 more incidents round out the 10 worst disasters, and together they illustrate problems that persist on Everest today. The mountain kills indiscriminately, and some people who climb it fail basic ethical tests. Before 1996, the deadliest season was 1982, with multiple tragedies striking across different expeditions. On May 15th, Marty Hoey was expected to become the first American woman to summit Everest when she fell from the north side at approximately 8,000 meters after her harness buckle failed. Rescuers never located her body. 2 days later, on May 17th, 2 of Britain's finest mountaineers disappeared on the unclimbed east-northeast ridge. Peter Boardman, 31, and Joe Tasker, 33, were last seen at 9 p.m. near a feature called the Second Pinnacle, at about 8,200 meters. Kazakh climbers found Boardman's body 10 years later. Tasker's body never turned up. Their disappearance led to the establishment of the Boardman-Tasker Prize for Mountain Literature, which remains mountaineering's most prestigious literary award. On August 31st, a Khumbu icefall avalanche killed 3 Sherpas during a Canadian expedition: Ang Chuldim, Dawa Dorje, and Pasang Sona. On December 27th and 28th, Yasuo Kato of Japan, who had become the first climber to summit in 3 different seasons, disappeared with Toshiaki Kobayashi below the south summit during a winter attempt. 8 or more deaths across multiple expeditions that year proved that Everest kills across all routes, all seasons, and all experience levels. The 2016 season produced 6 or 7 deaths, but one incident stood out. On May 21st, 4 climbers from India's West Bengal expedition reached the summit, and during descent, 3 of them ran into trouble when their oxygen ran out: Subhash Pal, Gautam Ghosh, and Paresh Chandra Nath. According to multiple reports, their guides left them and descended without them. All 3 died. The West Bengal case exposed a problem that persists. Budget expedition operators accept unqualified clients and employ guides willing to abandon them when conditions deteriorate. A similar situation occurred in 2006 when British climber David Sharp died on the north side, while approximately 40 climbers walked past without offering help. Sir Edmund Hillary, the first man to summit Everest, called the behavior horrifying and asked, "If you have a person who is in distress and is dying and you just pass on by, that's unacceptable. Helping a struggling climber in the death zone can kill you because oxygen is limited, strength is failing, and every minute spent on a rescue is a minute you might not survive." There's a difference between acknowledging those constraints and using them as an excuse to walk past a dying person. Before finishing, the most famous mystery in mountaineering history deserves mention, even though it doesn't fit the disaster category the same way the others do. On June 8, 1924, George Mallory and Andrew Sandy Irvine set out for the summit of Everest, and were last spotted at 12:50 p.m. by teammate Noel Odell, who glimpsed them near a rock formation high on the mountain before clouds blocked his view. Neither man returned. Mallory was 37 and already a legend, credited with the most famous answer in mountaineering when asked why he wanted to climb Everest: because it's there. Irvine was just 22, a young engineering student selected for his skill with the oxygen equipment. Whether they reached the summit 29 years before, Hillary and Tenzing remains mountaineering's greatest unsolved question. A search team found Mallory's body in 1999, remarkably preserved and lying face down on a rocky slope at about 27,000 feet. His snow goggles were in his pocket, suggesting he fell after dark. The photo of his wife Ruth that he planned to leave on the summit was not on his body, which led some to speculate he made it to the top. Irvine's body remained lost for another 25 years until a National Geographic team led by filmmaker Jimmy Chin found a boot with a sock inside in 2024, still labeled A.C. Irvine, the first physical evidence of Irvine discovered in a century. As of late 2024, a climbing permit on the Nepal side costs $11,000, rising to $15,000 in September 2025. Expedition companies charge an additional $30,000 to $120,000 for guides, Sherpas, equipment, oxygen, and logistics. Nepal now requires climbers to have summited a 6,500-meter peak before attempting Everest, and there's been discussion of raising that to 7,000 meters, but nothing has been approved. Solo climbing has been officially banned since 2017, though enforcement remains inconsistent. Starting in 2025, one Nepali guide must accompany every 2 climbers. Climbers now carry mandatory Reco tracking chips and minimum insurance of about $7,500 for death repatriation. They must bring down at least 8 kilograms of garbage and carry personal waste bags for human waste. China enforces stricter rules on the Tibet side, requiring a 7,000-meter summit for foreigners attempting Everest, and an 8,000-meter summit for Chinese citizens. The permit cap sits at around 300 climbers per season and is actually observed. On the Nepal side, Sherpas still do the most dangerous work, still cross the Khumbu icefall 30 to 40 times per season, and still account for nearly 40% of all deaths. Budget operators still accept unqualified clients, with 23 of 26 deaths in 2023 and 2024 occurring with budget operators. No hard cap on permits exists from Nepal because the $4.2 million in annual permit revenue is too valuable to limit. And 200 to 300 bodies remain frozen on the slopes, some of them used as landmarks by the climbers who come after. Mount Everest has killed over 340 people since 1922. The disasters covered today account for more than 100 of those deaths, from the first avalanche to kill climbers on the mountain, to the deadliest day in its history, to the deadliest season just 2 years ago. Some of those deaths were unavoidable because earthquakes happen, sea racks collapse without warning, and storms strike faster than forecasts predict. Many others could have been prevented. Climbers ignored turnaround times, guides abandoned struggling clients, operators accepted money from people who lacked the fitness or experience to survive at altitude. John Krakauer wrote something after 1996 that gets at the core of it. With enough determination, any bloody idiot can get up this hill. The trick is to get back down alive. Since 1922, over 340 people have learned what that means.